Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is a brief recap of my lecture on Nietzsche. I introduced you to the German-speaking philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived from 1844 to 1900. I tried to put him into the context of the origins of existential philosophy and what I see as postmodernism within especially the ethical tradition of Western philosophy. And while the terms existential philosophy and postmodernism can have sort of a wide range of meanings and interpretations, what I basically tried to argue is that there is an emergence in Kierkegaard and Nietzschean philosophy, Kierkegaardian and Nietzschean philosophy, a kind of a focus on how to be a concrete, unique individual in certain conditions of existence. And in particular, the conditions of our existence in the 19th and then more and more in the 20th and 21st century are conditions which combine large amounts of freedom, maybe more freedom than many of us have experienced in history, with more and more uncertainty about any kind of absolute or final answers in existence. And so this loss of certainty with regard to final answers about existence is what speaks to, I think, the idea of post-modernity. And, so in some sense, the moderns were identified by a kind of a commitment to science, and early on, especially a belief perhaps that science itself would yield a kind of a final theory of reality. And then the modern ethical philosophers were trying to find the sort of most coherent account of morality within the modern age. And what I've tried to argue in this lecture series is that, so far we haven't found that final or even best account of morality. And what we're left with is perhaps best understood as a series of frameworks or tools that we may use in trying to find increasingly productive or constructive moral discourse, since we can't give up on trying to solve the problems of morality, even though we live in this, what I would call, postmodern moment. And so I set the stage for an understanding of both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche by looking at existential philosophy and by giving you some notion of the possibility that we are now leaving the modern and entering the postmodern. And so then I went on to develop for you the life and career and some of the thoughts of Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a very successful scholar at a certain phase of his life, but ended up not doing so well within the halls of academia, despite having been really, really highly touted as a student, but yet ironically still went on to produce a body of work that is undeniably provocative of thought, I would say, to put it kind of mildly, and does so in a very short time because he unfortunately loses his mind. We think maybe he inherited something from his father, or he may have actually had a problem related to a case of syphilis that went untreated. Whatever the case was, he lost his productive capacities 10 years before his death, roughly. And so he had a very short sort of time as an adult to produce all the work that he did. And it's a testament to his work ethic, despite being very sick off and on most of his life, that he produced so much thought. And in many ways, I would argue, produced so much thought that speaks so meaningfully to the existential condition, the historical condition in which we are still striving to be humans, and particularly concrete individuals these days. And so I gave you a kind of an analysis of master and slave moralities from a Nietzschean perspective, where he looked at sort of the history of value systems in human cultures over the last few thousand years. And he thought he observed a pattern where there were two sort of general perspectives that were in evidence across human cultures. And those are the perspectives of the haves, the masters, and the have-nots, the slaves. And the power that the masters had access to, economic, political, social power, usually led them to embrace metaphysics and value systems that were life-affirming and self-affirming, and that the slaves who lacked political, social, and economic power did the one move that they could do, which is define power as bad and define their own powerlessness as good. And so the value systems and metaphysics from the slave perspective tended to be life-denying, this lifetime denying, and also to a certain extent, in a way you could say, self-denying, in the sense that they are not championing their beliefs, championing their abilities to make a positive contribution to existence. In some sense, they're celebrating and embracing a kind of an inherent brokenness and fallenness, if you will, if we appeal to particularly the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. And by embracing your fallenness and your imperfection and your limited nature, that you might find your way beyond this life into this kind of a final reward. And Nietzsche argued that that the history of cultures showed a balancing act of the master and slave moralities. However, he thought that the culture that he witnessed around him in 19th century Northern European Western civilization had an overabundance of slave moralities in the way that the Judeo-Christian tradition had come to be interpreted and had become so widespread. And so he thought that what was required to sort of do away with the overabundance of life-denying and self-denying value systems was your willingness to embrace your will to power, your sort of natural desire, your natural drive to sort of become more than you have been before, to overcome yourself, so to speak, and then wield the hammer and do philosophy with a hammer and engage in critique, in a social critique in a very meaningful and powerful way. And through such naysaying, through learning to say no, not like some rebellious teenager says no emotionally, but like a kind of a serious scholar says no by offering, a serious critique of something, again, just a thoughtful no, right? Based in some, data, some evidence, some reasoning. If you could learn to wield the hammer and engage in naysaying, that you could perhaps free us from the grips of certain value structures that are holding us back currently. And again, this was Nietzsche writing in the 19th century. He thought that his own culture was ill in this way. And I think that maybe, again, there's a kind of a way to update this and say, do we, I'm recording this lecture in the United States in 2020. Do we think that we make too much of certain celebrities? Do we think we make too much or pay too much to our athletes, as amazing as they are? Do we think that we allow too much wealth to accumulate in the hands of individuals? What is it about society today that you feel like is worthy of critique? Get out the hammer and critique, because that's the only way that you will update your own value system, and that's the only way that your society will have a chance to become updated. But the trouble is that we live in a kind of a historically unprecedented moment in the thousands of years of human civilization. We have the sort of curse of living in interesting times, right? Nietzsche would say. And this curse, this tragic historical moment, he expresses as sort of the death of God. And what he's saying is that since Copernicus, we have been sort of inexorably marching away from the center towards X. And by X, he means the unknown. And what he's saying here is that through our own unconscious will to power, we have generated a new level of scientific understanding, which has been powerful, but at the same time, it has undercut certain conceptions of the divine. Let's say something like divine command theory or natural law theory have been impacted by the march of science. Again, I think that you can make a case for how even, and I'll try to spell this out in this review a little bit, how even religious institutions can survive this moment in a Nietzschean way, but you can't just kind of passively hold on to the past, right? And if you do that, what you're doing is you're holding us back. And this is the sort of slave mentality. This is the herd mentality. It's all too frequent, Nietzsche would say. So you got to wield the hammer. The trouble is when you wield the hammer, in this moment, you not only see the way in which science has impacted certain value structures, certain metaphysics, and certain conceptions of the divine in this moment, you're getting a perspective on the way in which cultures have always overcome themselves, that the value structures of history, that the narratives that give purpose in history, that the conceptions of the divine that humans have generated, of that great mysterious source of existence in history, have always been overcome and continue to be overcome. And if you wield the hammer in this moment, the trouble is that you're going to uncover the nihilistic abyss. You're going to have to wrestle meaningfully with nihilism, because not only are we seeing certain stories like Genesis taken literally problematized in this modern moment, we're also seeing the history of the human conception of the divine problematized in this moment. The death of God is appearing into the possibility that humans are just not equipped to come up with the absolute truth about values to live by, both in terms of a good life and how to treat each other. And humans are just maybe not equipped with the ability to even come up with an overarching conception of reality that generates some clear purpose for us. And that we may live in the time where we wrestle with never maybe coming to grips, or never getting the absolute stamp of approval from outside of ourselves, from the universe or the cause of the universe, that we are on the right track. And that means peering into the abyss of the possibility that all that we're doing will one day collapse into the death of the star we call the sun. And that in some sense, the life that we are leading is the life of Sisyphus, rolling a rock up a hill only to have it roll back down the hill. And that is depressing. And that induces despair. And the uncertainty induces anxiety. And this produces a kind of a global level existential crisis. But Nietzsche claims that we can't avoid the crisis. In some sense, it's already happened and it's already unfolding. So all we can do is to go through it, right? To grieve, because it is a tragedy, and to go through it. And what does that mean? Well, to not become passive in the face of nihilism, but to stay active in the face of nihilism in this postmodern moment. And to become capable of yea-saying, of singing forth a song that we find beautiful, even though no song will ever be named the final song, of doing a dance that we find joyful, even though no dance will be the final dance, of embracing a picture of reality that gives us direction, embracing values that get us out of bed in the morning, even though we may never get told that this is the final answer, the final vision of reality, and the final value system. And that this will always get us out of bed in the morning. But if we do this, if we become these active nihilists, if we become active in the face of nihilism, having wielded the hammer, having honestly confronted the tragedy of the abyss and the frightening nature of the abyss, we will have our chance to inhabit the historical moment in such a way that we can see the abyss more as a canvas that is blank upon which we can paint our vision of a life. And like a bold artist, we can choose our values. And most of us, we're going to do this together. So this is not going to be the value structure of, the serial killer. Let's just dismiss from that right away. We need to find a way to be the authentic artist of an existence on a dance floor that we share. And we need to find a way to be the authentic artist of existence in such a way that it actually gives a wink and a nod of support to all those others who are becoming the bold artists of existence. And we need to do this in such a way that together we can collaborate as bold artists to find the values that will take us forward as a community. Now, I've gone beyond the sort of radical individualism that I think is there in the Nietzschean philosophy as an apologist of Nietzsche to argue for how I think he says that we can go forward. Let me go one step further and somewhat ironically defend a kind of a Nietzschean interpretation of the evolution of religious traditions, because I think so many people listening to these lectures are actually exhibiting this, right? Look, conceptions of the divine and practices and rituals and beliefs and scriptures and interpretations, I think Nietzsche's right, they have to evolve. But with that said, they can. And even if faith kind of becomes increasingly a very individual existence, it's still powerful to dance on the dance floor with other individual people of faith. And it's still powerful to be that person. Let me try to give you a more concrete example. Maybe that woman who says to her tradition, you have historically excluded me from positions of authority. That's wrong. I reject that. I reject that interpretation. Maybe I more radically even reject the notion of the divine as a he. We talk about wielding the hammer. But maybe in rejecting the notion of the divine as a father, as a he, in rejecting the tradition that you're a part of's exclusion of the female from systems of power, maybe you're a part of your tradition going forward. Maybe you are the re-inspiring, agent, right, of the evolution of your own tradition. And so, while Nietzsche is sort of infamous for his death of God metaphor, I actually think with a charitable interpretation of what Nietzsche's up to, we can see the way in which even faith-based traditions might go forward in this moment and even benefit from a kind of a Nietzschean analysis of what he ends up calling the Übermensch. And the Übermensch is the person that in some kind of deep Socratic way, like we've used it in this lecture series, is committed to asking the questions in the Nietzschean sense of wielding the hammer, of being able to risk decentering yourself, being able to risk not understanding who you are and what you're up to for a while, but then clearing the space within which you can then paint your new vision. And if you do that in faith-based communities or secular institutions, or literally within the world of art, or within the literary tradition, or within, philosophy, or within your own family of origin, if you can be the individual that paints your own vision, inspired by the kind of beauty, not a superficial, hotness, right? The kind of beauty that inspires, brings greater spirit, revivifies, right? Takes you beyond the despair and anxiety of existential crisis, revivifies, makes you alive than you've ever been before, more curious than you've ever been before. If you can do that, then in some sense, you're a part of this experiment to Human 2.0, the Übermensch, and you leave behind the herd and you leave behind the Untermensch. Easier said than done. But still, you may be a part of us all finding our way forward. And I wish you the best in that. This completes my brief review of my lecture on Nietzsche. Thank you. I wish you well.